At the company dinner for couples, my wife chose to go with her boss. I, her husband of more than 8 years, was replaced by a man she had known for just a few months. There was no conversation, no hesitation, not even the slightest embarrassment in looking me in the eye. She just smiled, adjusted her blue dress with thin straps, the one I had given her as a gift for our last wedding anniversary, and said, as if choosing an ice cream flavor, "I think it's better if we go separately today." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, turned my back, went home and watched the building's camera as the two of them walked down the stairs hand in hand, as if they were an official couple. And at that moment, right there, amidst the feeling of humiliation, contempt and that cruel silence that only exists in the souls of those who have been betrayed, I knew exactly what to do. I opened the drawer where I kept a divorce letter that I had written months ago, back when I could already feel something changing in her but refused to accept it. I put the ring next to the envelope, put on my best suit and went back to the restaurant. When I entered the main hall, the looks came. Some disguised, others blatantly surprised. She was laughing, drinking wine, touching his shoulder with her fingertips like she used to do with me in the beginning. I got to their table. It took her 2 eternal seconds to notice my presence, and when she looked at me, her eyes lost their color. I smiled, left the letter on the table and said simply, "Now you will live with your choice. I am leaving your life now. Don't look for me anymore." And I turned around. She didn't react. She didn't say a word. She didn't run. She didn't cry. And it was this indifference that killed me the most. Because at that moment I realized that she hadn't loved me for a long time. That I was only there for convenience, for routine, for habit. I left the restaurant with the feeling that everything was over, and as painful as it was, there was a certain freedom in the end. But the real pain didn't come right away. It came in the days that followed, when I came home and smelled her shampoo on my pillow, when I opened the closet and half of her was still there, untouched, organized, as if she would come back at any moment. It came when I picked up a cup of coffee and remembered that she always put too much sugar in it. It came when mutual friends texted me asking, "How's your heart?" and all I wanted was for no one to know. But they knew. Everyone knew. Some knew before I did. But no one had the courage to tell me. She didn't contact me the first week. Or the second. Only on the 11th day did I receive a message. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer. On the 13th, another message. "I regret it." I deleted it. And then the calls started. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she begged. Sometimes she tried to sound rational. She said she didn't want to lose everything we'd built. That it had been a moment of confusion. That the boss was nothing like she thought. But I wasn't the same anymore. I had already tasted the raw, cold, dry betrayal. And once you feel that, something inside you dies forever. I didn't yell at her. I didn't curse her. I just didn't answer. Silence became my armor. It was during this time of pain and reconstruction that I accidentally found a forgotten box inside an old cabinet in the office. There were letters, old photos, travel clippings, movie tickets, and love notes from a time that already seemed like it belonged to another life. Among the papers was a handwritten list titled, "Things to do with my wife before I turn 50. They were simple plans. A trip in a motorhome, planting a tree together, learning to dance the tango, renewing our vows on a deserted beach, adopting a dog. I read it with wet eyes but a dry heart. Because she had torn up that list without using her hands, without scissors, without a lighter, she had destroyed it with choices. The betrayal, in fact, was not going out with another man. It was killing dreams. It was throwing away promises that she once swore with tears in her eyes that she would never break. The cruelest thing about betrayal is not the act itself. It is the disregard for the emotional value that was built over the years. It is turning your home into a stage for lies. It is smiling at you while you are already sleeping with someone else. And the worst part, doing it naturally, like someone changing clothes. But even so, even carrying all of this, I rebuilt myself. I started over without making a fuss. I didn't post indirect messages. I didn't seek revenge. I just got up. I moved on. I met someone. Not a replacement. Not a patch. But a whole woman, who saw me in pain and didn't want to fix me, she just welcomed me. With her, the days had color again. Silence became peace again, not punishment. Touch became affection again, not debt. And one day, while we were having coffee together on the porch, she looked at me and said, "Do you know what I love most about you? It's this way of loving deeply, like someone who believes it can last forever." And I realized that, even though I was broken, I still knew how to love. That's when she showed up. The old one. The traitor. Standing at my door, holding in her hands the same list of things to do before I turned 50. She cried, saying she found it and realized what she had destroyed. That she still wanted to plant the tree, adopt the dog, learn tango with me. But all I could do was look at her strangely. Like someone looking at a painting that was once beautiful but is now too cracked to be restored. I didn't hate her. There just wasn't any more room. She realized. And before she left, she asked me, "Do you still love me?" I answered, "I loved you so much that there was love left for me. And that love healed me." She left in silence. And I was at peace. But what she never knew, and may never find out, is that I still had that divorce letter tucked away in the top drawer of my desk. The same letter I handed her that night at the restaurant, when it all began. But what she doesn't know, what no one else knows, is what was written on the back of that letter. One last sentence. One last wish. Something I've never had the courage to tell anyone. Until today. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, created to show, in an intense and realistic way, how infidelity can destroy lives, families and hearts. The objective is to reflect, move and awaken awareness. Get ready. You're about to hear a story shocking, which will stir your emotions from start to finish. Daniel and Laura were the kind of couple who drew curious glances wherever they went. There was something in the way they looked at each other, in their small gestures of complicity, that conveyed a sense of rare solidity. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they complemented each other in a way that seemed to have been rehearsed over years of mutual development. Daniel was reserved, meticulous with details, and extremely dedicated to his work as a strategic planning manager at a large technology company. He was the kind of man who didn't talk much, but said everything with his eyes. Laura, on the other hand, was spontaneous, sociable, full of energy, with a natural ability to attract people with her light laugh and the ease with which she made herself present in any setting. Working in the marketing department of the same company, she stood out not only for her competence, but for the charisma that overflowed in every presentation and every meeting. They met at an internal company event, when Daniel was assigned to present an expansion plan and Laura, at the last minute, had to replace a colleague in the visual communication department. The connection was immediate, not in the cliché romantic sense, but in a silent affinity that grew imperceptibly. There were weeks of casual encounters in the hallways, quick coffees between one meeting and another, until he, in an unusual gesture for his reserved profile, invited her to dinner. From that moment on, their story took shape. Their relationship was solid, without exaggeration or empty romanticism. They had long conversations, with comfortable silences. He listened to her with an attention that many men did not know how to offer, and she, in turn, brought a freshness to his life that took him out of his usual rigidity. They got married 3 years later, in a simple but striking ceremony. There was no exaggeration or ostentation. Just people close to each other, sincere looks and a silent promise that they would do everything to make it last. The house where they moved in was in a quiet neighborhood, where the most common sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional barking of a neighbor's dog. It was a two-story house with large windows, neutral-toned walls, and a wooden porch where they used to have coffee on Sundays. The furniture was chosen together, piece by piece, in a composition that mixed his minimalist taste with her warmer, more affectionate touch. There were paintings with phrases that Laura loved scattered around the walls, and a bookshelf that Daniel kept impeccably organized, with technical books and novels that she made him read. In the early years of their marriage, the two were in perfect harmony. Even though they had demanding work schedules, they made a point of maintaining small rituals that strengthened the connection between them. Dinners prepared together to the sound of jazz, board game nights on the porch, short weekend trips, even if it was just to a neighboring city. Everything was built with care, with zeal, with the awareness that love alone could not sustain a relationship. It required commitment, daily choices. And they seemed to understand this deeply. Laura, despite her lightness, had a demanding side when it came to professional recognition. She wanted more than to be seen as someone charismatic. She wanted to be recognized for her strategic ability, for her sharp vision of the market. Daniel supported her in this with genuine enthusiasm. He never felt the need to compete or belittle his partner. On the contrary, he encouraged her to soar with admiration. On many nights, he stayed up late reviewing presentations she had to give, correcting details and suggesting improvements. She, in turn, became his greatest ally in times of pressure at work, offering advice, words of encouragement, and sometimes just the welcoming silence he so desperately needed. Time inevitably brought changes. The company grew, promotions came, responsibilities increased, external pressures came. Daniel began traveling more frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time. Conversations became shorter, coffees on the porch became more sporadic, and dinners for two were replaced by quick meals between calls. Still, the affection did not disappear. There was a solid foundation there, a shared history, and they remained united, even if at a more mechanical pace. Laura took on a new, challenging project that required more hours, more visibility, and intense interaction with the company's leadership. She began to dress more boldly, not vulgarly, but with a confidence that made her shine. She began to attend corporate events alone, explaining that it was a matter of image and positioning, and Daniel, who trusted her completely, never questioned it. She continued to be absent from many of these events, usually because of travel, and calmly accepted when she said she would represent the couple. During one of these periods of absence, Daniel began to feel a restlessness that he couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy, nor was it distrust. It was a vague feeling that something was being lost between them. He tried to resume their rituals, proposed a short trip, wrote a romantic note like he had done in the early years. Laura responded with gratitude, but also somewhat hastily. She said she was overwhelmed, that it wasn't a good time. Still, he insisted. He prepared a special dinner at home, bought her favorite wine, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to open his heart in a vulnerable way. She smiled and thanked him, but her gaze seemed distant. Something there had changed, and he knew it, even if he didn't know exactly what. Life went on. Daniel started coming home earlier, he tried to prepare surprises, but he also started to notice more. Small delays, subtle changes in the tone of voice, answers that used to be full of enthusiasm and now sounded formal. He tried to justify it. Everyone goes through phases. That was it, just a phase. And she was tired, overwhelmed, pressured. It wasn't about him, it wasn't about them. It was just time. And time, sometimes, takes its toll even on those who love each other deeply. Her social media began to show more photos of herself, more stories from events, always smiling, always impeccable. Daniel, although uncomfortable, remained silent. He didn't want to be controlling. He trusted her. And he trusted what they had built. Until the invitation to the company's couples dinner arrived. Laura hesitated for a moment before saying that it would be better if they went separately, that he was always exhausted from traveling, and that it would be more comfortable for both of them. Daniel didn't understand right away. But he accepted. He said it was okay. Maybe she really was trying to spare him. That night, he stayed home. He prepared a simple meal, opened a bottle of wine and sat in the leather armchair by the window. The same one where he used to read while she painted her watercolors. He turned on the television, but didn't pay attention. He picked up his cell phone, opened the photo gallery and went through every moment they had lived. The birthdays, the trips, the lazy Sundays. There were sincere smiles there. There was love. And that was what hurt the most, realizing that something so beautiful could be lost without anyone crying out for help. As he stared at those images frozen in time, Daniel realized he couldn't remember the last time Laura had looked at him with the same sparkle as before. He didn't know when it had started to die, but he knew he had allowed it to die. For trusting too much. For loving too much. For believing that love, in itself, was enough. The clock was almost midnight when he got up, went to his office and opened the bottom drawer of the bookcase. There was a letter there. A document he had never imagined he would need to use, but which he had written in a moment of deep doubt, months before. He picked up the envelope, stared at it for a few seconds, took a deep breath and made a decision. In the distance, the lights on his phone flashed with notifications that he didn't have the courage to open. He knew something was about to change. Something that could crumble everything they had built, but also something that might free him from a bond that was no longer a bond, it was a chain. And in the middle of that silent night, between memories and documents, Daniel understood that love doesn't end with screams, nor with slamming doors. Sometimes he simply falls asleep slowly, until he doesn't wake up anymore. But what he didn't know yet, and what time would reveal to him, was that that night would be just the beginning of a series of events that would forever change the way he saw love, commitment and himself. The dinner was scheduled for a Friday night, in an elegant hall reserved only for couples and company leaders. It was a traditional event that celebrated the growth of departments and valued the bonds not only between employees, but also between their emotional peers. Daniel had been invited directly by email, as usual, but Laura had told him in advance that it might be better if he didn't go, since he was still recovering from his last business trip, and that his presence, although desired, was not mandatory. She had said this with a friendly smile, as if trying to be kind when suggesting something difficult to digest. Daniel, out of politeness and perhaps because of a slight feeling of discomfort that he couldn't explain, accepted. He didn't insist, but kept the suggestion to himself. During that day, everything seemed to be going normally. Laura got ready calmly, and at no point did she seem nervous or agitated, as she usually did at other events. She chose a dark, tight dress with thin straps, which Daniel remembered seeing for the first time in the window of her favorite store. He had bought it as a gift on a normal occasion, with no special date. She thanked him with a kiss on the cheek and a, "Thank you, my love," but the kiss was not warm, nor did her eyes shine. It was all subtle, imperceptible to the eyes of those who do not know a person intimately. But Daniel knew. He knew that something was out of place, even if he could not yet put his finger on it. When she walked out the door, smelling nice and confident, he felt a tightness in his chest, as if he had just witnessed a final farewell, even though there was no evidence of it. He spent the early hours of the evening between the sofa and the armchair in the living room, compulsively flipping through the channels, trying to escape the anxiety that was growing with the passing of time. He reached for a glass of wine, then another. The house was too quiet. Silence, in times of peace, is a comfort. In times of uncertainty, it is a crushing burden. Around 10 o'clock at night, he sat down in front of the computer and began to review some work reports, in an attempt to occupy his mind. But he couldn't concentrate. The clock ticked by and there were no messages, no calls, no sign of her. He knew that the company's social events usually ended early. Around 10:30, he decided to open the company's social network, something he rarely did, and that was when the discomfort turned into certainty. Among the photos posted by colleagues was an image of Laura. She was smiling, holding a glass of wine. Beside her, a man. He wasn't a stranger. He was the operations director, a respected man with whom Daniel had shared meetings and projects. The two were too close for a casual pose. His hands rested naturally on her waist, and Laura's smile wasn't that of a satisfied colleague, it was that of someone in a relationship. Daniel stared at that image as if he were staring at an accident in slow motion. He knew what he was seeing, but his brain refused to accept it. He reread the comments, the names tagged, the details. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a misinterpreted photo. Maybe it was an unfortunate angle. But something screamed inside him. An instinct that left no room for doubt. The night came slowly and heavily. Laura returned home around 1 a.m. She opened the door slowly, took off her shoes at the entrance, and entered the living room with the light steps of someone who did not expect to be confronted. Daniel was sitting in the dark, with his cell phone in his hand. She was startled to see him there and hesitated for a second. Then she smiled. She said that the event had lasted longer than expected, that she had been caught up in conversations with the company leaders. Daniel just nodded, pretending to believe, pretending not to know anything. There was no plan in his head. He just wanted to observe, feel, confirm what had already begun to take shape inside him. In the following days, Daniel began to notice everything more accurately. The slightly different schedules, the messages she typed smiling, the long meetings that didn't exist before. All of this mixed with an affectionate attitude that oscillated between automatic affection and a forced attempt to keep up appearances. Laura seemed to try to compensate, with small gestures, for the emotional absence that was becoming more and more evident. And it was this attempt that hurt him the most. The affection that came out of guilt. The touch that came out of convenience. The kiss that carried no soul. She still said she loved him, but the words came withered, faded, as if they had been said out of obligation and not out of real feeling. One day, when he arrived home early from work, Daniel saw her on the porch on the phone. Her back was turned, her hair tied up carelessly, and there was a slight tension in her shoulders. Her voice was soft, but there was laughter, there was sweetness, there was a tone he hadn't heard in a long time. When she noticed his presence, she quickly ended the call, as if it were something trivial. She said she was a friend from work, that they were working on something about the project. He didn't question her, didn't press her, but that image remained etched in his mind like a line on glass that, no matter how small, already announces a crack. That night, after she fell asleep, Daniel unlocked Laura's laptop. Not out of distrust, because, at that point, trust had already been destroyed, but because he needed answers. He wanted to understand what had happened to her, to them, to everything they had built. And there, among work folders and common documents, he found what he was looking for. A recently saved text file. A kind of diary, or outburst, where she wrote about the intense, unexpected passion she was experiencing. The words were so clear, so honest, that they seemed to have been written to hurt him. She talked about how much she felt alive, desired, heard. About how that man made her laugh again, how he gave her back a forgotten part of herself. And there it was, in raw letters, what he needed to confirm what he already felt. The betrayal was not just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, it was a breaking of everything they had promised each other. Daniel closed the computer with trembling hands. He got up from his chair and walked through the house as if he were treading on unfamiliar ground. Every room was now a corrupted memory. Every detail was proof that everything they had built could be destroyed by words typed in the middle of the night. The pain he felt was not that of losing a woman, it was that of being erased from her history without even being warned. Of having been replaced not by someone better, but by someone new. The novelty, the brilliance, the enthusiasm that he had once represented now belonged to someone else. The next day, he woke up before Laura. He made coffee, like he did on Sundays, and left everything perfectly laid out on the table. He sat down in front of her and, with the serenity of someone who no longer needs to shout to be heard, asked if she had anything to tell him. Laura hesitated. Swallowed hard. Tried to smile. But she didn't lie. He said he had gotten involved with someone at work. That he didn't know how it started. That it was never his intention. That everything happened too quickly. That she felt confused, divided. He said she still loved him, but in a different way. That she was lost. Daniel listened in silence. He didn't shout. He didn't bang on the table. He didn't humiliate her. He just nodded. It was like watching a collapse that you had already predicted, but that still hurts when it happens. She asked him if he wanted to separate. He said yes. And it was only then that she cried. She cried like someone who understands, too late, that certain choices are points of no return. She cried like someone who feels the weight of a door closing forever. Daniel got up, went to his room and came back with an envelope. It was the letter he had kept for months, hoping he would never have to deliver it. He handed it to her calmly, without words. And when he delivered that letter, he also delivered the end. But there was something she didn't know yet. Something he discovered later. A seemingly small detail, but one that would completely change the way she understood the consequences of her choices. She had lost much more than she imagined. And this detail, this secret, would only come to light when it was too late to undo the damage. Laura tried to rebuild. After the confession, repentance came in the form of small gestures and calculated words, as if she only had the will to erase everything that had been said, everything that had been done. She sent sweeter messages, showed up home earlier, prepared Daniel's favorite dish on Sundays. At times, the illusion of normality almost touched him. Almost. But not enough to reverse the abyss that she herself had dug. There was no more room for what had been. He withdrew gracefully, with that silence that hurts more than any aggressive word. There was no anger in his eyes, there was something much more definitive, absence. And perhaps that was the greatest punishment Laura could receive. He didn't shout, he didn't ask for explanations, he just stood there, increasingly distant, like someone watching the downfall of an empire that already knows it will not be saved. A few days later, Laura asked to talk. She said she needed to see where things were, that there was still time to rebuild. Daniel accepted the invitation and they arranged to meet in a quiet cafe, away from familiar faces. She arrived first and sat down at a discreet table in the back, anxious. When he walked in, she felt her heart beat faster. He was still the man she had known, but something about his posture was different. He was calmer, more confident. He didn't seem like someone devastated, but someone who had already weathered the storm and come out the other side with calloused skin. After a few minutes of idle conversation, she tried to make room for what was really bothering her. She said she knew she had done wrong, that she wasn't there to justify anything, but that she needed to be honest about what she felt. She said she still loved him, that she thought about him every day, that she regretted not her choice, but how she had allowed everything to be lost before trying to save it. That everything in her screamed for a new chance. He listened. And for the first time, he spoke firmly. He said he didn't doubt her regret, but that he had changed. That what he felt was no longer love, but something closer to gratitude for everything they had lived and pity for everything she had destroyed. That he didn't hate her, but that he could no longer recognize her as the woman he had once fallen in love with. She began to cry. Not a cry of hysterical despair, but a contained, shameful cry, the cry of someone who knows they have lost something valuable. Daniel then took his wallet from his coat, took out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, and handed it to her. Laura opened it carefully. It was a handwritten sheet of paper, in simple style, with numbered items. Things to do with my wife before I turn 50. She scanned the list as if holding something sacred. Travel in a motorhome. Learn the tango. Plant a tree. Renew our vows on a deserted beach. Adopt a dog. A mixture of naivety and tenderness wove together each of the ideas. That which she had given so little attention to now weighed like lead between her fingers. She looked at him, trying to say something, but couldn't. Daniel then continued. He said he wrote that list shortly after their wedding anniversary, on a normal day, after seeing her sleeping on the couch with a book in her hands. He said that at that moment he felt like the most complete man in the world, and that, even though he knew life could be hard, he believed that if they had plans, they could weather anything. She put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. She asked why he had never shown her before. He said he was going to show her at the end of that month, but that afterwards he felt something in them was changing. That he preferred to save it for when the time was more appropriate. And that time never came. Laura tried to touch his hand, but he pulled back slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then came the final blow. Daniel took his cell phone out of his pocket, unlocked the screen, and opened a gallery of images. He showed her a series of recent photos. One was of him smiling at a waterfall. Another was of him holding a dog in his arms. There was also a photo of him at a dance school, with his feet positioned next to a tango instructor. But what struck her the most was the last image. A woman with brown hair, a calm gaze and a serene smile, was lying in a hammock next to him, their hands clasped together. Laura remained silent. There was no aggression in Daniel. He wasn't showing off. He was simply showing that life had moved on. And that he had moved on with it. The woman in the photo was Beatrice. A nurse and a single mother. Daniel met her on one of his recent trips, during a flight that was delayed and forced passengers to spend hours in the same lounge. She offered him a coffee while he read, and through casual conversation, they discovered affinities that went beyond politeness and kindness. What attracted Daniel the most, however, was not her appearance or her discreet charm, but the way Beatrice looked at him with genuine interest, without expectations, without demands. She didn't know his past, she didn't expect anything from him. And because of that, he was able to be whole again. Without the shadows of what he had been. Laura listened to everything with a pale face. She asked if he loved her. Daniel replied that he was learning. That he was different, calmer, more mature. And that there was no pain in what he felt now. There was peace. A deep silence took over the table. Laura closed her eyes, as if trying to erase the image. She said she didn't know he still had the list. That she never thought he could rebuild himself so quickly. Daniel then said the sentence that would bury any remaining hope: it wasn't quick, it was necessary. When someone destroys what you built with love, you can choose to become ruins or foundation. I chose to start over. She still tried to argue, saying that she could wait, that maybe one day he would come back. But Daniel stood up. He paid the bill. He just said that he wanted her to find what she was looking for, and that now she knew that he was never what was missing. Laura was left there, alone, with the list between her fingers and her heart crushed by the knowledge that, of all the losses, the greatest of them was not the man who left. It was the woman she stopped being. But what she didn't know yet, what still hung unseen like a weight that would soon fall upon her, was what was on the back of that list. Something that would reveal more than the absence of love. It would reveal everything she had truly destroyed, and that impact was yet to come. Laura didn't go straight home that day. She walked aimlessly through streets that seemed narrower, rougher, as if the city had shrunk under the weight of what she had just discovered. The images she had seen wouldn't leave her mind. Daniel smiling for real, with someone else. The dog he said he wanted to adopt with her was now sleeping in the lap of a stranger. The hammock he had always wanted to hang in the backyard was finally occupied, but not by her. Laura's eyes scanned the streetlights, the cars passing by, the windows of the closed stores, but she saw nothing. The world around her was a blurred frame in front of the only clear image that hammered at her chest: she had been replaced. And worst of all, by someone who seemed to have understood exactly where she had failed. When she finally entered the house, the silence was cruel. The environment, which had previously overflowed with a sense of home, now seemed like a stage. The plants she watered every Sunday were there, motionless, silent witnesses to her absence. She climbed the stairs slowly, running her hands along the banisters as if she needed support to keep from falling. In the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside were still the cards he had written on birthdays, the movie tickets kept in envelopes and, at the bottom of the drawer, a small wooden box that she herself had bought at a craft fair, with the intention of keeping our secrets. Inside, there was only a crumpled piece of paper with 3 words written by him years ago: "You are everything." That night, Laura didn't sleep. She sat in front of the computer and revisited the years of their relationship in images, texts, and records. She realized how much he loved her with real intensity, not through social media, but through existence. While she was distracted by what she thought was empowerment, independence, and advancement, he tried to preserve what they had with small actions that she interpreted as routine. That emotional deconstruction set in like a physical pain. Her head ached, her stomach churned, but what hurt the most was realizing that no apology could rebuild what she had destroyed with her own hands. 2 days later, Laura showed up at his house without warning. She was carrying the list, now with the pages folded countless times, worn, and crumpled, and also an envelope with a letter. She asked for just 5 minutes, nothing more. Daniel hesitated, but let her in. The room was different. The decor was lighter, sunnier. There were new pictures on the bookshelf, but nothing of the new woman. Just spaces filled with serenity. She handed him the envelope with trembling hands and said it wasn't for now, but for when he wanted to understand everything. He didn't answer. He just nodded. Days passed before Daniel opened that envelope. It was a long, handwritten letter in which Laura told him everything she had never had the courage to say. She revealed her insecurities, the feeling of always being left behind while he grew professionally. She told him how small she felt in the world, and how her affair with the director was more of a cry for validation than a true passion. But at the end of the letter, there was something unexpected. Something he had never imagined finding there. Laura confessed that, during their relationship, she had found an old box in the office. Inside it was an album with records of a previous love of Daniel's. An old girlfriend from his teenage years, with whom he had had similar plans to those he had with her. At the time, that destabilized her. She said that she felt like a second attempt, a re-edit copy, and that it made her develop a silent resentment. But what she didn't know, until then, was that this album had been archived by Daniel precisely to preserve the memory of what had been, and not to compare her to anyone. He never talked about it because he thought that the past shouldn't interfere with the present. What really broke Daniel's heart, however, was in the last lines of the letter. Laura said that when she found that album, she became obsessed with the idea of finding out more about his ex-girlfriend. She even looked for her on social media and, when she found her, she created a fake profile. She started subtle, friendly conversations and got closer. She wanted to understand what was between them, what she had that Laura didn't. However, as the conversations progressed, Laura realized that this woman was dealing with grief. Her husband had recently passed away. She spoke in a melancholic but calm way. And, among her outbursts, she revealed that she kept in touch with an old friend named Daniel, who had been her childhood sweetheart, but that she respected his new life and would never interfere. Laura confessed that, at that moment, when she realized that the woman still had affection for Daniel in a clean way, without interference, something ate away at her insides. And that was when she did the unthinkable. Using her false identity, she sent her offensive messages, making her believe that Daniel was talking badly about the past and that he preferred to pretend she didn't exist. The woman, hurt and fragile, responded with just, "I understand, thank you for telling me." And she disappeared. She cut off all contact with Daniel. She blocked him on all social networks. Daniel never understood the reason for her sudden separation, but he respected it. Now, reading that, the truth exploded inside him with the force of a punch. He threw the letter on the floor and brought his hands to his face. The betrayal was no longer just an extramarital affair. It was the destruction of something he didn't even know had been sabotaged. It was the silent kidnapping of a part of him that never had the chance to say goodbye. The woman from the past was a good memory, a piece of youth that he preserved with affection, without threatening the present. And Laura, feeling inferior, attacked him cruelly, with cowardice, manipulating words, distorting feelings, hurting him without him knowing. The next morning, Laura showed up at his door. He expected a gesture, a response, anything. But what he found was an unrecognizable Daniel. Not angry, but cold. He said he had read the letter. That he now understood everything. And that, more than hurt, he was disappointed with the kind of person she had allowed herself to become. He said he had gotten over the betrayal, but that what she had confessed went beyond any line of respect. That she had touched a space that no one should touch, the memory of someone who was important, even if it was already in the past. She asked for forgiveness. She said she didn't know what she was doing. That she acted out of insecurity. But Daniel didn't give in. He said she had destroyed something that wasn't hers, that she had invaded, altered, and erased. And that forgiveness didn't mean continuity. He said that even if her heart softened, her soul would not forget. And it was at that moment that she understood. There was no going back. There was no more space. She had not only lost a man. She had lost the right to remain in his story. Daniel closed the door without hatred, without harsh words. And Laura walked down the steps with her body trembling and her soul torn apart. There were no more fights. There was no more hope. Only the echo of what could have been and would never be again. On the other side, Daniel took a deep breath. He looked out the window. Beatrice was making coffee, the dog was playing in the garden. The past had been buried, but with dignity. And the future, now, was a fertile field where there was no more room for secrets or ruins. He had survived, and, more than that, he had been reborn. The rain fell lightly on that cloudy morning, covering the window panes with drops that slowly ran down, as if time had decided to follow the melancholy of what had been left behind. Daniel looked outside without really seeing what was beyond the glass. It was as if, even surrounded by new things, there were still traces of the past trapped in details that he could not name. He no longer felt anger, nor sadness. What had settled inside him was an uncomfortable serenity, like someone who finally accepts that some things are not meant to last, no matter how much you have given, fought or believed. Laura's revelation had stirred a deep space, not because he still had feelings for her, but because she had crossed a line that could never be rebuilt. When you violate memories, invade what is untouchable, there is no going back. It is like breaking a piece of rare porcelain, you can glue the pieces together, but it will never be the same again. Beatrice, sensitive to the change in his gaze, didn't ask many questions. She realized that there were times when Daniel's silence said more than any outburst. She was by his side without taking up too much space, without pressuring him for answers. She was patient, but not submissive. She knew he was in the process of healing and respected each of his pauses. Some nights, he still woke up restless. He would go to the kitchen and drink water slowly, as if he needed to remind his body to exist. At those times, she would remain in bed, still but awake, waiting for him to come back on his own. And he always did. Sometimes he would lie down and sleep without saying anything, other times he would rest his head on her lap and just close his eyes. They had built a silent intimacy, a connection that didn't require proof, but that was strengthened by the lightness of their gestures. Meanwhile, Laura was distancing herself from the life she had known. She had not been fired, but her presence at the company had become uncomfortable, even for herself. The looks from some colleagues were discreet, but full of judgment. The director, the one who had once made her feel desired, now barely responded to her messages. He had moved on as if nothing had happened. She, on the other hand, felt stuck in a time that no longer existed. She moved to a smaller, more remote apartment. She sold her car, cancelled subscriptions, and reorganized her finances. Not because she had been forced to, but because it no longer made sense to maintain a structure that no longer represented who she was. She now lived between uncomfortable memories and frustrated attempts to rebuild her self-esteem. Every day, she passed by the same coffee shop where she had met Daniel in that last conversation. It was almost an involuntary ritual. I watched the people coming in, going out, the laughter, the hugs. And I thought about how all of that had slipped through her fingers because of impulsive and silently cruel decisions. Laura didn't know exactly what she was looking for there. Maybe she just wanted to see someone who looked like him, or maybe she wanted to catch a version of herself from before, smiling like someone who still believed she was worthy of that love. It was a kind of discreet self-flagellation, a cruel exercise in remembering what could no longer be. Daniel, in turn, began working on a new social project with Beatrice. They helped young people from underprivileged communities enter the job market, offering mentoring, workshops, and training. It was a way to use what they had learned in life, he in planning, she in human care, to transform realities. This brought them even closer together. Their shared purpose gave meaning to the new phase they were building. But even with all this, Daniel still had a wound that itched, a spot that still bothered him even without bleeding. Not for Laura, but for himself. He wondered, every now and then, if he had missed signs, if he had ignored her little cries for help that were disguised as distance, as indifference. This moral dilemma ate away at him on more introspective nights. Not because of the desire to go back, but because of the silent guilt of perhaps having contributed, even if only minimally, to the collapse. Beatrice noticed. One night, when she saw him staring at an old book on the shelf, the one Laura had given him as a gift in the early years of their marriage, she asked him if he still held a grudge. Daniel replied that it wasn't grudges. It was just the feeling of having seen a part of himself die. Beatrice then told him that everyone has parts that die throughout their lives, and that it's up to us to decide what we're going to plant on those ruins. Whether flowers or ashes. That touched him. Not because it was a pretty metaphor, but because it came from someone who had known real, concrete losses, and yet managed to flourish. Laura's life gradually became quieter. Not by choice, but by consequence. She tried to reach out to old friends, but found that some had drifted away without warning. Others welcomed her with courtesy, but not with warmth. She felt the weight of her own history reflected in the reactions of others. She began attending therapy sessions, something she had always avoided because she thought it was unnecessary. There, she broke down. Not only about the loss of Daniel, but about everything that had been ignored in herself for years. The insecurities disguised as independence, the old traumas transformed into emotional arrogance, the little lies she told herself to support the idea that she was fine. It was a painful process, but necessary. For the first time in a long time, she didn't want to go back to being who she was, but to discover who she could become from what was left. A few weeks later, Daniel received a letter. It wasn't from Laura. It was from Carolina, the woman from his past, the one who had been pushed away by a cruel game of false identity. The letter had been sent by a mutual friend who, without knowing the whole story, had spoken to her about Daniel, the social project and his new life. Carolina had written saying that, after a difficult time of mourning and withdrawal from social media, she had decided to revisit some stories from the past and that, upon investigating further, she noticed inconsistencies in what she had been told. He said he wasn't sure what was wrong, but now he suspected manipulation. He apologized for having disappeared abruptly and said that he had never held a grudge against him. He ended the letter with, "I'm so glad you've blossomed." Daniel read and reread that letter carefully. It was like closing a cycle that had been left too wide open. He didn't feel like responding. Not for lack of affection, but out of respect for time. Carolina was an important part of his story, but now he understood that the past doesn't need to be relived to be respected. He kept the letter with care, in a simple envelope, and placed it next to the old list. Not to hold on to what was, but to never forget how much he learned from what he lost. That night, Daniel and Beatrice went out to dinner. It was a small, candlelit restaurant with a band playing soft jazz in the background. They laughed about something trivial, shared a glass of wine, and talked about the trip they were planning. When the waiter brought dessert, Daniel took her hand across the table. He looked into her eyes and told her that for the first time in a long time, he didn't miss anything. And that if she wanted, they could start making a new list. Beatrice smiled, without saying a word. She knew the symbolic weight of it. It was more than a plan. It was permission to start over. Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the other side of town, Laura was writing in a notebook. Not a rant, but an attempt to reorganize her thoughts. She was listing things she still wanted to do on her own. It was a shy, uncertain, but honest list. For the first time, she wasn't writing it expecting anyone to read it. It was for her. Only for her. There was pain that wouldn't go away anytime soon, and she knew it. But she was also beginning to understand that regret isn't about saying sorry. It's about never again allowing the worst version of yourself to have control. There was still a lot to rebuild. But now, at least, she knew where to start. And even though she no longer had Daniel, maybe one day she could find herself again. Because before she lost him, she had lost herself. And now, finally, she understood what that really meant. The morning sun streamed through the windows with a serene tranquility, as if the world had finally understood the rhythm Daniel had chosen to follow in his life. The windows were half open, letting fresh air flood into the room decorated in light tones, with recent photographs and books scattered about in sincere disarray. Beatrice was in the kitchen, humming a soft melody as she prepared chamomile tea, and Daniel, sitting at the table with his laptop open, was reviewing the final details of the next stage of the social project they had structured together. That house, previously built on an anxious wait for recognition, now flourished with silent complicity and true presence. The noises of the street, the barking of the dog, the light aromas of the kitchen and the sound of pages being turned created a harmony that, although simple, was what he had always sought: peace, not the absence of noise, but the certainty that none of it came from pain. However, the calm of his new routine was slightly interrupted by an unexpected email. Daniel found the sender strange when he saw the name of an old college friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, but who was known for maintaining loose connections, the kind that always reappears with stories interspersed with coincidences. The content of the message was short, direct and carried a tone of contained curiosity. It said that he had participated in a literary event and, during an informal chat, met a woman who was working on a project of collections about mistakes and new beginnings. According to him, she had mentioned Daniel's name indirectly, talking about a relationship she had lost through her own fault and how that had profoundly changed her. His friend couldn't explain the details, but he found it strange that, even years later, someone would still tell such an intimate story with so much weight. Daniel didn't respond right away. He read the email twice, closed the computer, and stared into space for a few minutes. Something inside him stirred, not pain, not longing, but a feeling that stories, even when closed, continue to move in places we can't control. That night, he mentioned it to Beatrice casually. She listened attentively, without showing jealousy or discomfort, just genuine curiosity. She asked if he felt like finding out more. Daniel smiled with one corner of his lips and said no. That he already had all the answers he needed. But deep down, he knew there was a part of him that was still watching from afar, not out of a desire to return, but out of the strangeness of seeing the echoes of the past still vibrating in the present. Laura, on the other hand, continued trying to weave a new path with the loose threads of what was left. After writing to Daniel, she distanced herself from everything that could serve as a direct reminder. She deleted contacts, left social media, changed her number, and even changed her eating habits. These seemed like exaggerated gestures, but for her, every detail was a trigger. The apartment now had neutral tones, and the mirror in the living room was covered with a dark blue fabric, because she said she still couldn't bear to look at her own reflection without remembering what she had done. She began attending creative writing meetings, at first as a listener, then as an active participant. She discovered that there was something liberating in organizing thoughts with words, in giving shape to pain and, in a way, controlling it. One of the chronicles she wrote caught the attention of the curator of a small collective of women who talked about self-sabotage and reconstruction. She was invited to a discussion group and, with great trepidation, accepted. On the night of the event, Laura arrived at the venue with cold, sweaty hands, her eyes uncertainly scanning the room. She sat in silence, just observing. When it was her turn to speak, she began hesitantly. She said that she had destroyed the only thing that made her feel at home. That she had betrayed not only her partner, but herself. That out of insecurity, she had invaded stories that were not hers, distorted facts, and erased other people's memories. She said that she had lost everything, but that this loss, although painful, forced her to look inside herself honestly for the first time in her life. The women listened in silence. Some cried, others just nodded. There was no judgment. Just a collective sense that sometimes you have to completely fall apart to understand what true reconstruction is. As she was leaving, one of the organizers approached her. She said that her story needed to be recorded, not because it was for the sake of exposure, but because other people, in silence, make the same mistakes every day, and that perhaps hearing it from someone who lived and survived would be the push she needed to prevent further destruction. Laura hesitated, but agreed to write. She didn't use names, didn't give specific details, but she wrote with such raw truth that the text spread through groups, networks, and blogs. She received anonymous messages, some harsh, others emotional. But among them all, there was one that made her cry hard. It said, "You hurt, but you had the courage not to run away from your own guilt. That's more than most people have the courage to do." On the other side of the city, Beatrice and Daniel were at an airport, boarding the long-awaited trip that he always put off, waiting for the right moment. She joked that the right time is always now, and he gradually believed that more. While they waited to board, he allowed himself to look back, not as an act of nostalgia, but as someone who recognizes the path he had taken. The Daniel who was now boarding was different from the man who had once walked home with a divorce letter in his pocket and a broken heart inside. Now, there was a strength within him that did not come from forgetting, but from honest overcoming. He no longer wanted to go back, nor understand what he had been through. He just wanted to move on, without dragging debris behind him. During the trip, they had deep conversations about expectations, limits, and what each of them was carrying. Beatrice talked about her disappointments and the days when she thought about giving up on everything. Daniel, for the first time, talked about the silences that had accompanied him for a long time, even when he was with someone. He said that being with someone who truly listened was like discovering a new emotional language. They slept in each other's arms in a simple inn, listening to the sound of the sea crashing against the rocks, certain that they had arrived there not by luck, but by a conscious choice to rebuild themselves amidst the pieces of their previous lives. Meanwhile, Laura was invited to participate in a radio program focused on emotional health. Not as an expert, but as a living voice of someone who made mistakes and survived. She thought about refusing, but her therapist encouraged her by saying that talking about what she did with dignity could be her way of repairing, even if symbolically, part of the damage. On the program, she shared excerpts from her text, talked about the silence after a mistake, and how regret is different from remorse. She said that today she knew that true love is simple, but it requires courage. Courage not to run away from yourself, courage not to hide behind masks of strength or fleeting charm. Her words were impactful, not because they were perfect, but because they were real. That night, when she returned home, she found an envelope at the front door. There was no return address, just her handwritten name. Inside, a single sentence on a folded sheet of paper: "Sometimes, we have to lose everything to find out what was never really ours." Laura didn't know who it came from, but she knew it was what she needed to read. She smiled in pain. She smiled in gratitude. There was more to come. There was still so much to learn. But now, for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt to look in the mirror anymore. The world kept turning. The seasons changed. And even those who broke up in the middle continued, somehow, learning to walk. There is no eternal pain when there is a sincere desire to start over. And in that new phase, each of the three, on their own paths, discovered that the past, no matter how cruel it may have been, is never stronger than the decision to move forward with truth. The afternoon breeze carried with it a scent of lavender from the fields surrounding the small wooden house where Daniel and Beatrice would spend that weekend. It was a simple, cozy cabin, surrounded by nature and silence, the kind of refuge he never knew he needed until he learned to be at peace with his own silence. Sitting on the porch, he wrote in a notebook that Beatrice had given him months before, with a leather cover and thick paper pages. It wasn't a diary, more like a record of the days that had marked him after the reconstruction. For the first time, his words carried no weight, no urgency, just presence. Behind him, Beatrice was tidying up the small kitchen, laughing at the dog who insisted on stealing pieces of bread from the basket. It was a simple image, but full of new meaning. He was there, whole, after everything. And it wasn't an escape from the past. It was the mature acceptance that certain wounds don't disappear, but lose their strength when you look them in the face and understand that they no longer define who you are. At that very moment, a few kilometers away, Laura was walking along a dirt trail with her eyes fixed on the horizon. She was carrying a light backpack, a bottle of water, and a notebook, the same one she had used to write down her reflections since she had started sharing her story at events and support groups. It was the first time she had traveled alone since her divorce. Not as an escape, but as a choice. At the top of the hill, she sat on a rock and watched the trees move in the wind. There, in the middle of that silent vastness, she allowed herself to remember. Not with guilt, but with awareness. It still hurt, on some days. The absence, the loss, the emptiness of not having anyone waiting for her at home. But now, she understood that it had been necessary to walk to the bottom of the abyss to understand the need for her own reconstruction. In her notebook, she wrote that there is no greater pain than losing yourself trying to be someone for others. And, at the same time, there is no freedom more beautiful than finding your own voice again. Months had passed since Laura and Daniel's paths had crossed. Not out of resentment, but out of respect. They both knew there was nothing left to say. There were no bridges to rebuild. What had been said, what had been experienced had left its mark, and what had been destroyed was no longer part of what they were now building. On a rainy afternoon, when he opened his work email, Daniel came across a notification for an article published on an emotional health platform. It was a text signed only by L, but he recognized the writing. It spoke of silent betrayals, of the small acts that distance us from those we love, of ego disguised as self-esteem, and of the hope of one day being able to forgive oneself for everything. Daniel read it to the end, took a deep breath, and, for the first time since the end, smiled when he saw her name. Not out of longing, but because he realized that, even in the midst of chaos, she had decided not to stay where everything had fallen apart. He didn't respond. He didn't send a message. He just closed the tab and went on with his day. Because sometimes the greatest gesture of love someone can offer is to not invade anymore. The following night, Beatrice entered the room with an envelope in her hands. She said that she had received a response from the publisher about the book he had sent without much expectation. It was a collection of chronicles, experiences, reflections on human relationships and new beginnings. He had not expected much. But the envelope contained a proposal for publication and an invitation to participate in a series of lectures in several cities. Beatrice cried. He remained silent for a few minutes, just looking at the paper. Accepting meant exposing part of his story, it meant opening up his scars so that others could learn from them. And he knew he was ready. Meanwhile, Laura, now more serene, received an invitation to work as a regular contributor to a digital magazine focused on emotional reconstruction. She would write weekly about relationships, forgiveness, guilt and maturation. It was the beginning of a new cycle, no longer to redeem herself from the past, but to transform everything she had experienced into a lesson for others. Some nights, she still missed having someone by her side in bed. But those nights, previously filled with pain, now came with the reminder that she was learning to be enough for herself. She had accepted that not all loves are eternal, but that they all have something to teach us, even the ones we destroy. On a sunny afternoon, Daniel and Beatrice walked hand in hand through a craft fair. In the middle of the stalls, he stopped in front of a table of handmade notebooks. He chose one, ran his fingers over the cover and said he was going to start a new list. She smiled and asked what the first items would be. He replied that he didn't know yet, but that he wanted to do it together. Plant a tree, maybe. Or learn to play an instrument. Simple things. Real things. At the end of that day, they sat in a square, the sun setting in the background, and talked about the future as if they were talking about something possible. There were no fancy promises, just a commitment to the truth. They knew that love is not the absence of pain. It is a daily choice. And they were willing to choose each other, without fantasies, but with truth. Laura, on the other side of life, was packing her bag for a lecture she would give the following week. She looked in the mirror and realized that there was something new in her reflection. It wasn't vanity. It was peace. It hurt to get there. But now, she understood that the deepest betrayal she had committed was not against Daniel, but against herself, by ignoring her essence to fit into a role she didn't even know if she wanted. And because of that, she was finally ready to move on. And so, each in their own way, they found an outcome that was not perfect, but was true. Daniel learned that pain does not have to last forever, as long as one has the courage to look at it honestly. Laura understood that forgiveness is not acceptance of the mistake, but liberation from the weight it brings. And Beatrice, with her patience and firmness, showed that there are new beginnings that do not require grand gestures, just continued presence. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment here with your opinion, your vision, and if any part of this narrative touched your heart in a special way. Also, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and follow more stories like this. Remember, betrayal destroys love, trust, family, and everything that was built with effort and dedication. An impulsive choice can cost the most valuable thing, mutual respect. This channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories are fictional and serve as a mirror for us to reflect on the real consequences of our decisions. Until the next story. And take good care of the ones you love, because love does not always resist neglect.